Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. And I'm joined in the studio by Professor Krzysztof Jabłonka as we continue our talk about Russian-Polish conflict. Professor, by 1610, the Poles had got to Moscow. Hitler never quite managed it. Napoleon was there for a few months, but the Poles were there for 2 years. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Po bitwie pod Kuszynem 4 lipca 1000.
After winning the Battle of Kushino on July 4th, 1610, against the combined Russian-Swedish forces, the road to Moscow was essentially open for the Poles. On the 27th of August, at night, the Polish hussars were simply let into the Kremlin. The Poles did not even have to conquer it by force. However, they did it so that false Dmitry, who was promoted by the House of Romanov, did not take the Kremlin themselves. At that moment, negotiations on how to make Władysław IV Vasa the Tsar of Russia took place. Actually, one can say that for 2 years, from 1610 to 1612, Władysław did rule over Russia. Because it was in his name that the documents were issued, his seal was drawn up, although Władysław himself was not in the Kremlin. Why? His father changed his mind. He refused to send him to Russia because he feared that his 16-year-old son would surely be murdered there. So he demanded from the Russians a guarantee of safety for his son, which the Russians did not want to give, and the Orthodox Church, which was very backward at the time, spoke with great hostility against the Poles. The uprising against the Poles started in at least 3 places. The most famous place is Nizhny Novgorod, where a merchant went to Dmitry Pozharsky, a Russian prince known for his military leadership, and convinced him to rebel against the Poles. Almost all cities in Russia took an oath to Władysław IV Vasa. Nizhny Novgorod did not take such an oath, and the uprising started there. It reached the Kremlin in 1611 and was taking over Moscow. Poles, in order to be able to defend themselves, burned down the settlement outside the city walls, and it was considered as a sacking of Moscow. The whole area was built of wood, so it was not difficult to set fire to it. In the diary of one of the Polish nobility, there is a 4-page description of Russian buildings, followed by a short sentence. And we burned it all in 3 days. The Poles, or rather mercenary troops, mainly consisting of Germans and Lithuanians, commanded by Wincenty Gosiewski, a Lithuanian hetman, defended themselves together in the Kremlin until November 2nd, 1612, when the agreement on the capitulation of the Kremlin was made. It was signed over a few days. On the 4th of November, the so-called Seven Boyars, that was the Russian government connected with the Poles, left the Kremlin. The Russians called this government collaborative, although it was a very reasonable government of Prince Mścislawski. The Russians have chosen this day as their national holiday, a holiday of national unity. On November 7th, the Polish army left the Kremlin, but only partially. The Russians did not honor the agreement and murdered some of the soldiers. When the second group of defenders saw it, they locked themselves in one of the strongholds, and when Alexei Trubetskoy's troops launched to attack the Formation Cathedral, they blew themselves up.
Oni wysadzili się w powietrze.
Okay, so Professor, while the Polish forces were besieged, having difficulties in Moscow, there were attempts for other Polish forces to come and try to rescue them. How did that work out?
No, ruszył na pomoc Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, drugi wielki hetman, oczywiście litewski, bo koronnym był Żółkiewski.
Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, the second Grand Hetman of Lithuania, came to help the besieged Poles. Chodkiewicz reached the walls of the Kremlin, however he was not able to stay there. A 500-strong German unit entered the Kremlin with help. Unfortunately, their food wagons didn't make it through. There were some obstacles and they had to withdraw. The Kremlin collapsed too early. Though the subsequent aid, which would have arrived there in a month or two, was on its way, but there was really nothing to eat, and there were incidents of cannibalism. Some soldiers, mainly German, were kidnapping local Russian people to eat them. When this was detected, it was considered vile. Such behavior considered to go against all norms, and those who were caught doing it were all executed by the Poles themselves. There were a dozen or so Polish noblemen who wrote diaries while besieged. In these diaries, they described these events. In the meantime, the Smolensk fortress fell, and it became possible for Polish forces to advance deep into Russia. However, the Polish nobility, not the king, was in power of military affairs. Back then, in Poland, there was a system known as a noble democracy, and it was the nobility who decided about money. They refused to finance the king's war effort, thus stopping the flow of money, which was the lifeblood of the war. They feared that if the King of Poland became the Tsar of Moscow, and Sigismund Vasa wanted to do so, he would turn it into an empire. One of the nobles even wrote a short story entitled De Imperio Sarmatico. An empire is not compatible with democracy. Not even the British could achieve that. So they decided that they preferred their own democracy without conquests. At this point, the fate of the Polish crew besieged in the Kremlin was sealed. Jan Struś, a Ukrainian magnate, surrendered the fortress on honorable terms. He himself was treated very decently by the Russians, but his soldiers were not. At the beginning of 1613, the Ziemski Sobór, which was the parliament of the Tsardom of Russia's estates, met. That was the only such meeting which roughly resembled a parliament. The next such meeting took place in 1917, 3 centuries later. Michael of Russia, from the House of Romanov, whose father was interned in Polish captivity, was elected Tsar. He came to Poland with the deputies who got detained. They were technically not in prison, but they also could not leave. In this way, the Romanovs claimed their rights and finally stopped inventing false Dimitris and other false rulers.
Romanowowie dobili się wreszcie swoich praw i przestali wymyślać łże-Dimitrów i jakichś fałszywych władców.
That's all we've got time for on this episode. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Professor Jabłonka for joining us. Do join us again on Poland Daily History, where we delve into the fascinating and long history that is Poland.